This is the second video lecture on the chapter of global stratification. In the first video lecture, we discussed, or I discussed, what is meant by stratification. So remember, the stratification refers to the layering of groups of people, and particularly how this chapter is about the different kinds of stratification around the world, but then also how the world is stratified itself. And I talked about slavery and the caste system. So in this video, I want to talk about two other systems of slavery, systems of stratification, and I might get into some of the theories about where stratification comes from. So one that I found that students are less familiar with the name, but they're familiar with the concept, is something called the state system of stratification. So this is the kind of system that we would have seen in medieval times. The idea that the king, you have the different estates. So if you think about pre-city states where you would have had a castle, like, oh gosh, I would have drawn this on the board. You'd have a castle, and then you'd have the area around the castle, and all of the peasants and the farmers would pay taxes. So it's Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood and Shrek. So the peasants all produce goods, and then they pay the king, but in return, they get protection, because instead of there being like the state of Kansas and the state of Nebraska, you would have the kingdom of, I don't know, King George and the kingdom of King Fred, and those would be your city states or your estate, right? So the system is based on, you have the leadership would be the king, and the king is the royalty at the very tip top. And then the next layer would be like the family or the close kin to the royalty. So you would have your lords and ladies, the cousins and the in-laws, and these would be the folks that would marry across classes. And then below them, you have the knights and the warrior class, or the military, so to speak. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have the third state, which would be the peasants and the people that worked out in the village. So I don't know if you watch Downton Abbey, for instance, that's an example of an estate system. You have the villagers. Now it's a little bit, they don't have the knights anymore. But the significance about the state system is there is a little bit of room for mobility. You could be born a peasant, and if you exchanged your life for, it became a knight, or you became a warrior, you could move up in the system. It wasn't terribly likely that a peasanter or that a commoner could become royalty. Like if you're interested in the story of the royals, the royals in England today, you got the story about King Charles, or Prince Charles, and Diana. Diana was not a peasant. She was not a commoner. She was actually within that, the second estate, and she just happened to marry up, so to speak. So it's, anyway, so the practice of that word right there, prime, I should have listened to it on Google before I put it on the slides. That is where the resources would all be transferred through the eldest son. So it was essential that the king bear a son, and it was his firstborn son that would inherit the kingdom. I'm trying to take some other examples. If you watch Vikings, there's the state systems in the Vikings, not the Vikings per se, but when they are confronted with, when they fight England, certainly you have it in Robin Hood, you have it in, if you think about all of these systems as being ones that, where you have the people that make the decisions, you have the supporters. So you can kind of think of it as, oh, this I don't want to get too far down this road, but if you have like the president, and then you have Congress people, and then you have the military, and then you have everybody else. In that regard, a lot of these systems are basically very, very similar. So the class system, what's significant about the social class system, which is obviously what we have in the United States, is it is thought to be the most open of all of these other systems, right? And to offer some mobility. Where the estate system, there was a chance of mobility, for the lucky few. The estates, the caste system, there's no chance of movement. You're born and you die in that. And certainly in the slavery system, there were really only like two. You were either, property or you own property, the social class system has the greatest chance that you will move about. And there's now, even having said that, it's a myth as exactly how far you can move about or how common or how likely you are to move about. But there is, at least the structure allows for movement, for social class movement. There are two kinds of mobility. You have something called inter and intra social class movement. One is a system where you're born into one state of the social class and you die in another. I believe that's inter. Intra, I believe that's right. I should have looked that up too, is when you move across generations. So your parents may have been poor or your grandparents may have been poor, but you are a CEO. And one of the things that has happened in the modern American social class system is it used to be really common. It was sort of standard that your parents and your grandparents would have been at a social class that was lower than you, and every generation gradually did better. Well, with my generation, that trend began to shift. And today it is not as common or necessarily as assumed that you will do better than your parents. Today, in order for me, for instance, my relative social class rank, my relative social class location is not as good as my parents, but I have more education than they did. So one of the things that's happening in the American political economic system is this middle class, the gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. There's a bigger gap, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter too. That chapter is all about the American social class. But for our purposes, and you'll see this ladder again, social classes based on economic resources, income, wealth. Now, a couple different theories, and that's what these next couple slides are about, or what are how do we define one's relative rank, right? We've talked about how those people get, like, we've talked about the different labels that groups get, the caste system, slavery system, social class, but why is this so? Right? How did it come to be this way, or how do we explain it? The two major theorists I want to talk about, and again, we'll talk more about them in the next one as well, are Marxist theory and Weber's theory. Now, Marx argued that there's effectively two social classes. You have the owners and the workers, right? So kind of like with the slave system. You have the people that own the slaves, and you have the slaves themselves. You have the pimps, you have the prostitutes. You have the prostitutes that do the work, and you have the pimps that pimp them out, right? That profit. You have the people that own the company, and you have the people that work in the company. One group, right, is this two-class model. One group exchanges themselves, exchanges their wages, exchanges their time for, they give their time, they give their physical labor, they give their blood, their sweat, and their tears in exchange for $1, right? In exchange for a wage. That is the proletariat. Those are the workers. I should put that right here. Those are the workers. Then you have the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie are the ones that profit from the people working. So they benefit. They're the ones that get rich over the work of the workers, right? So these are sometimes called the capitalists or the owners. These are the owners or the capitalists. This, it creates, and I guess it looks like that might be on my next slide, but this creates class conflict. So these two, this is where Marx gets to his theory about conflict theory, is that he says all social groups are either owners or workers. What class consciousness is, the realization, is the awareness that you know you are being exploited or that you are an exploiter. I would, unless you own a business and you own people, we're all being exploited. We all would fall into the category of the worker, right? So that's class consciousness. False consciousness is the idea that I erroneously think I am an exploiter instead of being exploited, or I fail to recognize that I am being exploited just like my fellow human, just like my neighbor, just like my colleague, just like the person that works on the assembly line down there. That is false class consciousness. Or when I identify, I think that my interests are the same as the people who are doing the exploiting. When I relate to them, when I agree with social policy that makes it easier for rich people to get rich, instead of recognizing that when it's easy that they're getting rich easier because it's easier for them to exploit me. That's false class consciousness. And again, I think I'll talk about those more in the next chapter. And then Weber's theory, what Weber says is that social class is what he would call the SES, or the social, he actually is the one credited with the social economic status, ECONO, economic status, or your SES. And he says, or argued, that social class is way more complicated than that. That it's based on a combination. It's a status that is a summation of these three aspects. One of them, and you can see it here. So power, property, or prestige. So property is how much you own, right? It's it's your wealth, it's your houses, it's your stuff. Your power is your ability to influence other people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And then your prestige is how much positive you regard. And so he acknowledges that sometimes people can have really high social rank, but have very low property. So take, for example, a priest or a bishop, right? They don't own any property, right? They take a vow of poverty, but yet they have ability to influence people. They have power. How do they get their power? They get their power by their prestige. Or sometimes people's prestige will translate into property, and then that property can translate into power. So take people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, who was an athlete, and his athleticism gave him prestige. His prestige eventually translated into wealth, and his wealth eventually translated into power, and he became the governor, right? So this whole relationship, sometimes having money is what translates into prestige and ultimately translates into power. I think you could probably argue maybe Ronald Reagan or even Donald Trump, right? Ronald Reagan, who was an actor, his prestige, I don't know how that worked. Now, prestige translated into property would translate it into power. Certainly Trump had wealth, and this is what gave him prestige. And eventually both of those men were the president, or the leaders of the most powerful nation in the world. So I will stop this right here. And when I come back, we'll talk about some of the history of stratification, or some of the theories behind the history of stratification.